North Korean regime and certainly the identity of the current leadership, there's absolutely no prospect that I can see that this problem will get better. I don't think there's any active way in which we can promote that, but we ought to think about what conditions might lead eventually to that kind of change.
Dr. Cha, finally.
I agree with my colleagues. I don't think Chinese pressure will necessarily stop North Korea's program, but I think what Chinese pressure can do is force the North Koreans back to the negotiating table. The theory of the case of that is, I think, in 2003, when China temporarily cut off oil, the North Koreans agreed to the six-party talks, and then again in 2007, when the Treasury Department undertook actions that led to a seizure of North Korean assets in a bank in China that clearly put a lot of pressure on the regime, and they came back to implement an agreement. So I think there is precedent there. I entirely agree with my colleagues that I'm not sure how much China is willing to put that kind of pressure on North Korea, but one could argue that the situation is a little bit different now because the Chinese are desperate for some sort of diplomacy to take place. They really don't understand what President Trump might do, and they feel they have no control over North Korea, so they may be more receptive than they were in the past.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, first of all, these hearings are very significant. We get people like you, and there's no more qualified panel we could have to advise us and to reflect on it. But also, these are public meetings, and I see the other value is to informing the public of things that we assume up here they already know about. And I'd like to concentrate on just the North Korea, because I've always had this bias that that's where really the serious problem is. We're talking about two things here. We're talking about their development in the technology over a period of time in developing a bomb, a weapon, and then secondly, a delivery system. And just real quickly, let me run over that. In the delivery system, North Korea goes all the way back to the 1970s. In the 1970s, they had the Scud-B, and everybody remembers that, and then they forgot that for a couple of decades. Along came 1990, the first Nodong missile test fire range was 1,300 kilometers. Then a few years later, in 2006, the test fires of the Taepodong-2 long-range missile that was had the capability of traveling 15,000 miles, then firing the Taepodong-2 missile, which they said was satellite launch. December of 2012, North Korea launches a rocket that puts the first satellite into space. We've watched their progress all the way through to 2016. North Korea launches a solid fuel ballistic missile from a submarine. And then lastly, Kim Jong-un declares that North Korea is in its final stage in preparations to test an intercontinental ballistic missile. And you see what they've done in that period of time. I have to almost conclude that the guy really means it when he comes out with a statement. But then going back to the bomb, in 2006, we had an explosion that was 1 kiloton. In 2009, that was up to 2 kilotons. 2013 went to a third nuclear test, was an atomic bomb with an estimated explosion of 6 to 7 kilotons. And then finally, September 9th of 2016, as the fifth and latest nuclear test registered 5.3 in magnitude with an explosive yield estimated between 10 and 30 kilotons, which is about the same as it was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 10 times stronger than what North Korea was able to do 10 years before. So you've gone over that period of time. When we talk to the military, and we will have them in on Thursday, I understand, I know that they'll say that the two big problems that distinguish the threat that comes from North Korea from other threats is that, first of all, you're talking about a mentally deranged guy who's making the decisions, and secondly, this country has been more consistent in both developing its weapon and the delivery system, and come to the conclusion that, as I've come to, that I believe that there's an argument that could pose the greatest threat to the United States. And I'd like to just kind of get a response, if you would, Dr. Cha, to that. First of all, are we accurate in terms of that technological development over that period of time, and does that relate to the threat?
Thank you, Senator. I think what you just described is entirely accurate in terms of a systematic plan by the North Koreans over the past decades to develop a capability that seeks to threaten the U.S. homeland. I think there is no doubt about it that that is what they are after. As I mentioned earlier, they have done 71 of these tests since 2009, which is a step increase from what we've seen in the past. They've done 7 tests since the election of our current president. They have over 700 Scud missiles, 200 to 300 Nodong missiles, and the pace of their development and the history of development shows that they want to be able not just to field one missile that could potentially range the United States, but a whole slew of them. So this is a very proximate threat. You're absolutely right, Senator.
Yeah. Any other comments on that? Is it completely unreasonable that as a result of this we could consider North Korea as the greatest threat facing the United States? Dr. Freiberg?
I think it's certainly it's the most imminent. I don't know that it's the greatest in terms of its magnitude in the long run. As Dr. Tellis said, I think China presents a greater challenge, but certainly it's the most imminent. And one thing to add, just to make the picture even worse, it's conceivable that the North Korean leadership may believe not only as they acquire these capabilities that they're going to be able to extort more economic goods from the world, and not only that they're going to be able to deter action against them, but that they might believe at some point they really had an option for reuniting the peninsula. They might believe that Japan would be deterred by the threat of attack on bases on its soil from allowing the United States to use it as their rear area to support operations on the peninsula. They might believe that the United States would be deterred from coming to the aid of South Korea.
Well, my time's expired, but the military also says that it's the unpredictability that we have there. Everything else is pretty predictable. You know, we all look back wistfully at the days, for some do anyway, I do, the Cold War, when things were predictable. We knew what they had. They knew what we had. Mutual assured destruction meant something. It doesn't mean anything anymore. But that unpredictability is what the military is going to tell us on Thursday is the major problem that they have with North Korea. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, given all of that discussion, and given that the neighboring problem, China, continues to be very aggressive, so you're advising us as policymakers, as people who pass appropriations bills, what to do. So what to do to deter North Korea and further Chinese aggressiveness?
So this gets back to a point earlier. You know, we really need to double down on our regional ballistic missile defense. THAAD on the peninsula was an important step, but there's more to be done. I think, for example, we could consider putting THAAD in Japan. I think there are additional deterrence things we could also do with the Japanese and the Koreans together, whether it's more operational cooperation in the air and on the sea. We should consider a whole range of options, even including potentially strengthening our extended deterrence commitments to the Koreans by potentially rotating dual-capable aircraft to the peninsula, which would be a big move. So there are additional things I think we can do on the deterrence side and the posture side that would be particularly relevant and applicable to the threat.
But you don't think that that would deter the North Korean leader, do you, from continuing this development of nuclear weapons, missiles, and then marrying a nuclear weapon to a long-range ICBM?
No, Senator, I do not, but I do think it would help reassure our allies and also put us in a better position in the event diplomacy fails.
And do any of you have any reason to think that diplomacy would succeed with this North Korean leader?
Even if it doesn't, we cannot do anything else without exhausting the alternatives offered by diplomacy. Because dealing with North Korea at the end of the day will require a coalition effort. And we have to satisfy the expectations of our coalition partners that we've made every effort in the interim to deal with the challenge. And so we have to think of it in terms of a multi-step game. As Dr. Cha highlighted, the immediate objective should be to get the North Korean regime back to the negotiating table. The ultimate objective must be to hope that there will be evolutionary change in the regime. But between those two bookends, we have to think seriously about what is required for deterrence, what is required for defense, and what is required for denial.
Anybody else on?
Senator, the only thing I would add to the list that Kelly enumerated is that I think those sorts of posture moves and strengthening of deterrence and defense, they're good for our allies. They certainly increase the cost for China of allowing the situation to continue as it is and might make them more receptive to putting pressure on the regime. In the end, the problem we have is that North Korea feels no pain for the direction in which they're going. Their people are feeling pain, but they don't care about their people. So the immediate tactical effort is to try to get the regime to feel the pain, and that requires China to stop subsidizing 85% of North Korea's external trade as well as some of their leadership's funding. So that's the proximate tactical goal, to try to at least get some leverage on the issue, because right now we have none.
Describe the aftermath if we saw that he was readying a ICBM that could reach the U.S., Alaska, Hawaii, and we decided to preemptively take out the assets that we knew where they were, which is more difficult because they're now movable. Describe the aftermath of what would happen and what would be their retaliation.
Well, we don't know for sure, but I think the assumption for several decades has been that they would begin with a massive artillery barrage against Seoul, which is within range across the militarized zone. The North Koreans have, for years, exercised and tested special operations forces, chemical and biological weapons. The fear would be that they would unleash all of this. I don't know that they would necessarily, because the next step would be the annihilation of the North Korean regime. But the fear is that that's their capability, and they might. Just a note on that. I'm not a psychiatrist, so I wouldn't want to judge the current leader's sanity or lack of sanity, but it does seem to me that North Korean leaders have been rational in their behavior. It sometimes appears odd and it's very threatening, but it's purposeful and it's been consistent. And I think for that reason, it's important also to remain focused on what it is that would probably deter them, which is the threat of personal annihilation. So the threat of we and our South Korean allies would, if we needed to and could, destroy the regime and destroy the leadership. I think that's a message that they understand.
Just to add to the question on the aftermath, we've got 28,500 U.S. troops on the peninsula. That's just the troops. That's not their families. So there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of dependents in addition to the Koreans. Japan is within range, so I think Japan would take a hit, potentially. There would be significant economic impact, frankly, to war on the peninsula, which I don't think anyone is talking about. And the regional actors like the Chinese would move in. They would not sit on the sidelines and watch, the United States trying to rearrange the peninsula in their favor. They would certainly try to intervene at some point, and that could also have catastrophic consequences. So, in terms of an aftermath of a U.S. strike, there are particularly high costs.
If I may just add to that, obviously the most confident thing we can say is that we don't know how the regime would respond. But I think it would depend on whether they saw the strike as a discrete effort made at resolving a specific problem, or whether that is the leading edge of a larger effort at replacing the regime itself. If it was seen as a discrete effort aimed at resolving a specific problem, one can hope that their response would be more restrained. But if it is seen as the leading edge of an effort to replace the regime, then I think all hell breaks loose. At this point, whichever the choices are, I agree with Ms. Maximin completely. The Chinese cannot afford to sit on the sidelines because it undermines their core interests of preventing the rise of chaos on their frontiers and keeping the United States and its military forces as far away as possible from their borders. Those two variables change dramatically if the United States engages in military action on the peninsula.
I'll just, Senator, to add to this very quickly, all I'll say is that I think it is absolutely true that the North Korean dictator's number one goal is survival. If the United States were to carry out a strike, the North Koreans may feel like the only way to survive is to respond, retaliate, and as my colleagues have suggested, what would follow from that. The other way to think about it is that if they do not respond, that could also threaten the survival of the leadership in the regime. And I'm still looking for the intelligence analyst who can tell me which of these things the North Korean leader will do, because I haven't been able to find one yet.
But Senator Nelson described a situation in which our government is almost certain that a strike is imminent. And in that case, now I'll start with Dr. Tellis, if our response was a discrete strike to prevent that, might it not be worth it?
First, I don't know the basis for the judgment that there is a danger that is imminent. But if we assume the premises of your question, it may be worth it if we could be assured two things. One, that the North Korean response will be limited and that the effects of our strike will be permanent. That is, we will be able to cap the North Korean capability at some level and not go beyond. And two, that the Chinese will actually intervene in ways to force the North Koreans to reach some sort of a diplomatic understanding. And I'm not confident that either of those two conditions would actually obtain.
Well, rather than have all of you respond to that, I'll take that answer. Dr. Friedberg, you say the United States doesn't have a coherent, integrated national strategy for Asia Pacific. Instead, all we've got is the remnants of a 2 decades-old strategy. And yet, the Defense Department's 2012 strategic guidance said we will of necessity rebalance toward the Asia-Pacific region. And the QDR 2 years earlier said in essentially the same thing. Was rebalance to Asia-Pacific words only?
Well, with deference to my colleague who worked hard on making it happen, I don't think it was words only, but it was the ratio of words to deeds, I think, was not what it should have been. We talked a lot. We did some things. We didn't do nearly enough for a variety of reasons. I think the previous administration was became preoccupied with other problems in the Middle East and with Russia, continuing constraints on defense spending. Some
issues arose outside Asia Pacific.
Yes.
To our surprise.
Yes. And this continuing budget constraint. So I think for a variety of reasons, not enough was done. I agree that the general concept, the idea that we need to focus more of our resources on the Asia Pacific was the right one. And many of the things that the previous administration started, I think, were worthy. But for various reasons, they didn't or weren't able to follow through adequately.
Well, let me shift then back to North Korea. And there's been mention of regime change I'd like any of you to comment about the scenario in which that might happen. Also, Dr. Tellis mentioned evolutionary change within the regime, and I suppose you could say at the end of the Cold War, there was certainly an evolutionary change in Moscow, which gave us hope for a little while. But what do we know about the decision-making process within the regime in North Korea, and who has a good understanding, if not the United States, about the decision-making team surrounding Kim Jong-un? And I'll start with you, Dr. Friedberg.
I don't think our knowledge is very good. I think the assumption of most people is that the decision-making is concentrated very heavily in the hand of the current leader and maybe a small circle of people around him. As far as this evolutionary versus revolutionary, in the latter part of the Kim Jong-il regime, and I think at the very beginning of the Kim Jong-un regime, there were people who hoped that there might be a greater willingness to open up. The Chinese, I think, had some hopes that they might be able to persuade the North Korean leadership to follow a path more similar to their own, retaining tight political control but opening up economically. I think the Chinese may also have had some hopes that there were people around the new leader who they could influence. Many of those people have been executed by Kim Jong-un, I think precisely because he feared that they were Chinese agents of influence. So the prospects for evolutionary change seem grim, in part for the reason that Dr. Cha mentioned, and I think this has been a mistaken assumption at times that people in the outside world have made, that if we offered the right kinds of inducements to the regime, in particular if we offered economic inducements, the opportunity to join the world, to improve the livelihood of North Korean citizens and so on, we could somehow influence their policies. The problem is the leadership doesn't care about those things and doesn't value those things and sees openings as threatening. So I don't see much prospect for evolutionary change of this particular leader.
Any other panelists have observations about the decision-making team?
I think right now it is almost wholly in the hands of this one individual. I think there were others in the past who were around him, but as Aaron said, they've been systematically executed. The level of purging inside the system is unprecedented, not just at the highest levels, but also at the military Army Chief of Staff, Deputy Chief of Staff level. There's been unprecedented fluidity there as well. So all of this suggests that there's significant churn inside the system and that the leadership is facing certain challenges and he's dealing with them in one way, which is just to purge everybody. The Chinese would have been had the best insight into what's going on inside of North Korea, but I think that after the leader executed his uncle, the Chinese have lost all really windows into North Korea. And I think it's a mistake. I mean, we often hear in the press how the Chinese are upset with the North Koreans. That's why there are no high-level meetings. We actually did a study on this, looking at all Chinese-North Korean exchanges going back to Kim Il-sung and Mao. The difference today is that there are no exchanges, but it's because the North Koreans don't want to talk to the Chinese. They're not interested in talking to the Chinese, to the United States, or anybody else. And that's what's so worrying about the current situation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all very much for being here. You've all pointed out that China does not want to see instability on the Korean Peninsula, that it's not in their interest. And Dr. Cha, you pointed out that China's not willing to take action. I think maybe everybody's made that point against North Korea. Do you then agree with Dr. Tellis that the more uncertain they are about the potential for President Trump and the United States to engage in war on the peninsula, the more likely they would be to weigh in and to try and help address the North Korean situation?
Yes, Senator. I mean, an argument could be made, I think, that in terms of what is decades-old U.S. entreaties for China to do more, that there may be marginally more leverage today than there has been in the past, largely because I think the Chinese feel the situation is getting out of control, And I think they feel like they don't have any ability to manage either side, the United States or North Korea. And I think Xi Jinping wants a good relationship with the U.S. president. And this U.S. president, does seem to signal at least some unpredictability when it comes to North Korea. So in that sense, I think we might have marginally more leverage than in the past. But again, it's all tactical. It's not a strategy yet, right now.
And I think I would probably feel better if I felt like what we were doing right now was part of a strategy towards North Korea and Asia. So in that context, what is a mess up like we had with the Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group do in terms of the signals that we might be trying to send to China and to our allies and to everybody in Asia about what our intentions are?
Well, I will say that was a pretty big screw up. I also think it really undermined our credibility among our allies. The fact that you're seeing, South Korean commentators and politicians commenting about that, about how it shows the United States isn't reliable. I mean, I think it's an unfortunate incident. I don't know how it happened and how it occurred. I'd be curious to hear what Admiral Harris has to say about that on Thursday. But it had a serious effect, and it was kind of like, in Texas we have the saying, all hat, no cattle. So you don't want to show up with all hat and no cattle.
Everybody, I assume, agrees with that. Along those lines of how can we better send signals about what our intents are, what does it say to both our allies and our adversaries in Asia that we're right now not able to get a budget agreement here domestically, that we have divisions in Congress about how we're going to fund defense in the next year? I mean, what kind of messages does that send to those people for whom we want to project strength? Dr. Friedberg, I think you mentioned that as part of when you were talking about what our allies are looking at in the United States versus China.
Yes. Well, it certainly doesn't help. On the other hand, it's not entirely new. So people have been watching us and the unfolding of our political process for a while. I think there's an undercurrent of concern which has been present for some time about our reliability and our staying power and our capacity to mobilize the necessary resources to do the things that we've been talking about doing. I do think that those concerns have grown since our election, or in the course of our election campaign and since the election, because at least in terms of rhetoric, the current administration, or the candidate Trump, before he became president, raised questions about all of the essential aspects of our global posture, our alliances, our commitment to free trade, our commitment to universal values, and so on. Now, it may be in the long run that the policies that he follows won't deviate as much as the rhetoric seemed to suggest, but all of that, I think, has added to the sense of anxiety about where the United States is going that many in the region feel. And on the other hand, there is this growing concern about China.
Well, and along the lines of escalated rhetoric, to what extent does that escalation of rhetoric against North Korea then produce a response in North Korea that not only heightens the situation, but provides attention that Kim Jong-un may be interested in having from the world?
I think there's a window. There's only so much unpredictability that you can pull off, and there is some leverage that may come from appearing to be willing to do things that perhaps seemed unlikely before. That's, I think, one of the reasons the Chinese did step in. It was right at the time of the run-up to the war in Iraq. We were still hurting from 9/11. There was a perception that the United States might do all kinds of things to reduce the threat. And similarly now, because of the rhetoric and behavior of the new administration, I think there's a moment at which there's a lot of uncertainty. The Chinese aren't sure, the North Koreans aren't. I suspect that that's got a half-life. It's going to diminish over time. And I think that's what the Chinese are playing for, sort of waiting to see. I'm not sure that they really believe at the end of the day that for all of the tough talk, we're actually going to do something as risky as launch an attack on the North Koreans in the near term. Whether the North Koreans believe that or not is another question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the panel's wise counsel on a lot of these very important issues. Let me talk about the issue I know a number of you brought up, but the importance of our allies in the region and globally, but particularly in this region. Would you all agree that one of the most important strategic advantages we have as a nation is that we're an ally-rich country and that our adversaries or potential adversaries, whether it's China or Russia or North Korea or Iran, are ally poor? Would you all agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, on the strategic balance sheet of assets and liabilities, our alliances are certainly on the asset column.
And that the countries that don't have all the allies are consistently trying to undermine our alliances, whether it's China or Russia. Would you agree with that? So yes. Let me just ask a kind of broad-based question. You know, a number of us try to get out to the region a lot. We go to the Shangri-La dialogue on a regular basis. You know, there's always this discussion about how China has this great long-term strategic vision and they have the ability to see around the corners of history, and we don't have that capability. But when you're in the region, it certainly seems that their aggressive actions in the South China Sea are actually driving countries away from them towards us. And this isn't just our traditional allies, but it's countries like Vietnam, it's countries like India. So I think initially, I certainly, and I think some of our colleagues here had some concerns whether the Trump administration fully understood this strategic advantage when you watch the campaign. But now that they're in office, whether it's General Mattis's first trip as SecDef to the region or the Vice President's trip that he's finishing up here to the Asia Pacific, certainly seems like they're focused on it. But are we doing enough? What more can we be doing to bolster this very, very important strategic advantage we have with regard to our deep network of allies, deepening it, expanding it, and making sure that the Chinese don't try to fracture it? What more can we be doing? I'll open that up to anybody.
I think we need to be doing at least two things to start. First, we need to publicly commit to protecting the regime that we have built in Asia over the last 60 years. That this regime is not open for negotiation, that the United States will not walk away.
So we need to put out red lines. You know, the Chinese put out red lines on Taiwan, on Tibet, but yet we don't seem to put out our own strategic red lines in the region. So you're saying with regard to our alliances, we should make that a strategic red line? Absolutely.
And the second thing we need to do is we need to think of our alliances in exactly the way you described, as assets, not liabilities. And the third thing that I would emphasize is that the U.S. needs to avoid appearing wobbly. Yeah. To the degree that we create uncertainties about our commitments to the region, it only opens the door for the Chinese to do exactly what you described.
Any other thoughts on allies? Real quick before I turn to my next subject.
Yeah. Certainly, consistency is key. Clarity of message from the United States is key. Bipartisanship on Asia policy is important.
I think you have it for the most part.
Yeah, I think it's actually pretty good. Initiatives like Maritime Security Initiative that this committee initiated last couple years. I mean, those kinds of physical demonstrations of American commitment and interest in the region. But also, really, the United States needs to present an actual vision and a strategy. And I think at the heart of that, our goal needs to be that we want to ensure that the region is able to make choices on the economic side and on the security side independent of coercion. And that, for a lot of countries in the region, is the key.
Let me turn to, speaking of, and Dr. Chow, I'll let you address this one first, but speaking of coercion and allies, the issue of China's actions in the South China Sea have been a concern of many of us on this committee. You know, Secretary Carter put forward a good policy. Will fly, sail, and operate anywhere international law allows. The problem was the execution, in my view, was weak. It was inconsistent. It undermined credibility. This committee seemingly had to push. When they actually did do their first FON-up, they seemed embarrassed about it. The Secretary of Defense was right here. He wouldn't even admit it to the chairman. So what do we need to do with regard to FON-ups? My view is they should be regular, so they're not newsworthy, and they should be done as possible with coordination with our allies, and they should not be done in terms of the way the Obama administration did them with regard to innocent passage. We're not asking for innocent passage. We don't recognize these built-up land masses. So what should we be doing to make sure we don't fall in the trap? Good policy, bad execution undermine our credibility, in my view. With the new administration, what should we be doing on our policy with regard to FONOPS? Dr. Chow, I'll start with you, sir.
Well, I think, Senator, you provided the solution right there, which is that we need to approach these things as standard, as non-political, as not big statements of policy. We should just do them quietly. And
we've been doing them for 70 years, right?
On a consistent basis, absolutely. And if I could say on your other question, I think, I just finished writing a book on the history of the U.S. alliances in Asia, and they are very unique historical assets, as Dr. Friedberg said. The only thing I would add to everything my colleagues mentioned is that we need to network better our alliances. These are largely bilateral hub and spokes, and we need to build the tire around that hub and spokes, whether it's in terms of missile defense or collective security statements, things of that nature would be great value added for our alliances.
Great. Anyone else on the FONOPS? I look forward to reading your book, by the way.
I'll send you a copy.
So just quickly on the FONOPS, I completely agree they need to be more regular. If we make them more regular, then they become a little less peaked every time we do them. But they can't be the measure of our strategy in the South China Sea. Freedom of navigation and overflight is important to preserve, but it can't be the entire strategy that we have. And so we need to think about the long game, and that goes back to the maritime security capacity building initiatives that we have. It also means we need a real regional diplomatic strategy on the South China Sea so that the arbitral tribunal ruling actually has effect. That is where we actually missed a huge opportunity last year, was with the ruling and not really pursuing a real diplomatic effort at the regional level. We kind of backed off from it, tried to calm the waters, which was important at the time, but we never really followed through with an actual diplomatic game.
I think we need to do three other things. The first is we need to conduct FONOP operations at the discretion of the PACOM commander.
Yeah.
I don't think they should be centrally controlled from Washington. And that gets you to where you want, which is regular, unpublicized, so on and so forth. The second is we need to stay away from innocent passage, because the moment you talk about innocent passage, you're actually reaffirming a particular Chinese view of its rights under UNCLOS,
exactly,
which we have never accepted, and which the Western world, in terms of freedom of the seas, has never accepted. So we need to stay away from that like the plague. And the third is, as part of the strategy, we need to provide tangible reassurance to our partners, which means actually building up their capacity to stand up to coercion, which might mean enhanced training, which might mean providing them with weapons required, and ultimately backing it up with a constant U.S. naval presence in the area. Now, it doesn't have to be every day, but it's got to be regular enough that the regional states begin to feel comfortable that the U.S. is at least always around the corner.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to focus on our chairman's focus on this part of the world, and he's proposed a budget, an appropriation amount. So this has to do with APSI. So $7.5 billion of new military funding for U.S. forces, and perhaps this is a question for Ms. Magnuson and possibly one for Dr. Chow. So U.S. forces and their allies in the Asia-Pacific, and these funds could be used, as the chairman noted in his opening, to boost operational military construction, increase munitions procurement, enhance capacity building with allies and partners, and expand military exercises and other training activities to help combat the movement toward a basically Chinese influence throughout the Asia-Pacific region. So, Ms. Magnuson, how can this fund, this money, and this initiative impact the U.S. role in the region? And how can we incorporate this initiative into a larger, more holistic Asia strategy that includes maintaining regional stability and improving diplomatic ties?
Certainly. Well, I'm supportive of the initiative in part because we need to stem the bleeding. We're woefully behind in terms of what we need to be doing in the Pacific, in terms of our presence and our capabilities, our ability to, fill critical munitions gaps, prepare runways that are going to be necessary in the event of a conflict. I mean, it's stuff like that. And so this initiative, I actually think, is hugely valuable and fills a very important budgetary gap for the Pacific. So I would be supportive of it. But I think it goes back to the larger point of the United States needs to be seen strategically as investing in this part of the world. And, there is signaling value beyond just the sort of regular value, the actual value of the initiative. There's signaling value to the initiative as well in terms of our commitment to the peace and security in the region, and then our willingness to make the actual investments to make that possible. I think, the region would perceive it very well. I think our allies, if we were able to use that kind of funding to do more work, to network the allies and partners, as Victor was suggesting, in this, principled security network is what we called it in the Obama administration. But the reality is we need more funding. We need more presence and capability.
Senator,
Dr. Chow,
yes.
would you like to? And also, how important is it, you are a Korea expert, how important is it to utilize a whole-of-government approach to maintaining stability in the region, recognizing full well that we don't have very much information about what goes on in Kim Jong-un's mind? And it's hard enough, it's challenging enough regarding our complicated relationship with China. So in terms of stability in this part of the world, would you also support this initiative, by the way, APSI, and how we can do more of a whole-of-government approach?
I mean, I think those two questions are completely connected to each other in the sense that our effectiveness in being able to get China to do more, or to signal to North Korea the credibility of our deterrence or any of our policies, greatly depends on whether the region sees us as committing to it and having staying power. As Aaron mentioned in his testimony, there is a grand game taking place in Asia today where the Chinese are trying to erode U.S. credibility, reliability, and resiliency in the region, and replacing it with the fact that they are there, they are big, and they have a lot of money in their pocket.
And they really do engage in a whole-of-government approach in this area.
Yes, yes. And so there could not be a single more important signal of U.S. staying power in the region than something like APSI that is investing in the things that constitute the U.S. security presence in Asia. And I think that will then redound positively in terms of the credibility of our North Korea policy, the credibility of what we say to China.
And would you, all of you agree that maybe our staying power is really continuing to show up? So I think it was important for Secretary Mattis to visit Japan and South Korea as his first official secretarial duties. But the continual emphasis and showing up part of the message that we have a commitment to this part of the world is an important aspect, as well as the practical parts about funding and resources. Would you agree, all of you? Okay. Ms. Magnuson, you mentioned that the Carl Vinson issue, that was a big screw-up. So how is the United States viewed right now in this part of the world? You can respond as well as the other panelists. Very briefly.
Well, I wouldn't say that the Vinson issue should be determinative of how we're viewed in the region, but our credibility is our currency. And so the minute you undertake actions that undermine credibility, that has a profound effect in the region in terms of how we're perceived. So the Vinson was just one incident, and I'm sure there's very good reasons for why it happened, but the reality is it created a perception of lack of credibility.
So if we have a range of, I hope you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, a range of that we're viewed credibly, about 1 to 5, the 5 being we're viewed credibly, where would you put the U.S., how that part of the world views us, including the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, Australia? Where would we fall in terms of our credibility, 1 to 5, 5 being the highest credibility?
I think that's a question for them.
Okay, well,
I think
give me a
that
number.
the United States has been a credible power in the Pacific. The question now is, can we continue to be one?
Anybody wants to weigh in very briefly?
Well,
Just give me a number.
Well, I would say that we were probably below 3, but then we've seen a series of trips by the administration with Secretary Mattis, Tillerson, the Vice President, that I think have helped to send a very positive signal to the region, taking us over that threshold.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of the witnesses for being here. I think the importance of the Asia-Pacific region has been well highlighted by this testimony and also by the well-justified public focus on the threat of North Korea. I want to start by focusing on North Korea specifically and ask the panel to assess the following hypothetical, which is if tensions were to escalate to the point of a targeted military strike against North Korea's nuclear facilities. How would the witnesses assess the probabilities of 4 potential outcomes? 1, a retaliatory strike with North Korean nuclear weapons. 2, a retaliatory strike with North Korean conventional weapons. 3, the attack precipitating a collapse of the North Korean regime, and 4, the attack precipitating direct Chinese military intervention. And I'd ask it to any of the witnesses on the panel.
I think it would depend, I guess, in part on exactly the character of the strike. And we had talked a little bit about that earlier, whether the regime would perceive it as something that was intended to be surgical or as the forerunner for an attempt to overthrow it. Obviously, the more the regime worries that the United States and the South Koreans are now coming to get them, the more likely it is that they'll let loose.
But let's assume the strike was targeted at taking out nuclear facilities.
Yeah. I don't think the prospect in the near term of collapse would be very great because there wouldn't be anything directly that had been done to weaken the regime. I would think the likelihood of conventional response would be very high. I would put the likelihood of a nuclear response somewhat lower because then all bets would be off. And as far as Chinese intervention, I would think that would be unlikely unless and until the Chinese leadership believed that the regime was about to collapse and North Korea was about to fragment and South Korea and the United States were moving forces towards their border. I don't think they would do it unless those conditions had been met.
Senator, I used to think that the response would be conventional, that they have 10,000 artillery pieces, that they would use those. But these days, looking at the character of North Korean missile testing, my guess is that the response would actually be on Japan to try to split the U.S.-Korea alliance from the U.S.-Japan alliance. Because at least the character of their testing recently has been focused on demonstrating an ability to target with ballistic missiles all U.S. bases in Japan, flying missiles within 200 kilometers of the Japanese shoreline. So that's what I think that they would do, and I'm not clear if the attack itself, as you describe it, would be able to eliminate all of their nuclear facilities, because I don't think we know where they all are.
I'd agree with Victor. I think that they would definitely go after Japan. I disagree a little bit with Aaron on the Chinese intervention point. I actually do think the Chinese could potentially try to intervene just to preserve stability on their flank. What that looks like and how that materializes, I don't know. But I don't think that the Chinese would just sit back, even if it was a targeted strike. Now, the thing that would change that might be whether or not in advance we could get the Chinese to hold back. But I still have extreme doubts that they would do that.
I suspect the likelihood of a nuclear retaliatory response is relatively low because we would still have the capacity to have escalation dominance in that scenario. I think a conventional retaliation is inevitable, and it would be aimed both at South Korea and Japan. in order to communicate the credibility of the North Korean leadership and its determination to protect its survival, as well as to split the alliance. The key question about China really hinges on whether the Chinese see the targeted attack as really being the first phase of air-ground action to follow. And if they perceive air-ground action to follow, then it's almost certain that they would intervene to try and prevent this from escalating further.
In y'all's assessment, short of military action, how much positive impact could China have in reining in North Korean hostilities, and what would it take for China to exercise its influence and power?
Well, I think we're talking about China going someplace it's never been before, and unfortunately, I think the only way that's going to happen is if they think that the United States is going to go someplace it's never been before. I think, based on my experience as a negotiator on this issue in the previous administrations, I feel that the only time China ever responds is not in response to anything North Korea does, because they just assume that's a constant. It's the variation in U.S. behavior is what they take notice of, and what I think the current administration is trying to leverage right now.
So what U.S. behavior do you see as maximizing China's beneficial influence on North Korea?
Well, I think the United States right now is trying to signal a combination of muscularity, unpredictability, and decisiveness all at the same time, largely because they feel like the past administration was 8 years of predictability and indecisiveness. And that's a hard thing to manage. I think it's hard to manage all those things because there are conflicting signals, but they seem to be trying to walk that line right now.
If you ask what would be the sort of outer limit of what China could do, assuming that it was willing to do almost anything, it could bring North Korean economy to its knees. It's pretty close to that already. It could cut off the flows of funds that go across the border into China, into North Korea, partly from the so-called illicit activities that North Koreans engage in. It could interdict components that flow into North Korea through China that support the special weapons programs. It could do a lot. Now, the question is what might induce them to do that? Seems there are a number of possibilities. One is the prospect that the United States was, as Victor suggests, going to do something really drastic that could have catastrophic consequences. They would have to believe that, and I don't think at this point they do. Another possibility would be somehow to persuade them that the entire relationship with the United States was on the line, including, in particular, the economic relationship, and we were willing to do things that imposed costs and pain on China that would be so great that it would be a danger to the Chinese regime, and therefore they might do something that we would want them to do to pressure North Korea. I don't think we're willing to do that, but it's theoretically possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for a very interesting discussion here. And actually, I want to pick up on the comment about the economic relations between these two countries, because it seems to me, between us and China, that this is a kind of a new paradigm when it comes to international relations, and that we're dealing with a country that we actually have very close economic relations with, and it's not a situation where you can impose sanctions on China and not have some of that blow back on the United States. We're not talking about unequal partners here in the equation. And when you think about the conflict with the Soviet Union back in those days, we had a closed economy, not really tied to the U.S. It was a completely different dynamic. And I think some of the thinking, and I heard about a change in strategy from each of the panelists, that in the past we thought by engaging in trade and engagement that would actually liberalize the Chinese culture or the society. That has not been the case, so that theory didn't really play out. Also, the theory is if you're more engaged in trade and more engaged in engagement, you're less likely to have an armed conflict. Is that theory not going to play out in China as well? So maybe if the panelists could talk a little bit about how we have this mutual dependence between China and the United States and how that limits some of the tools that we have in order to engage with the Chinese with some of these behaviors that are becoming quite troublesome to our national security?
I think you're right that it's a new paradigm, but it's not unique historically. In fact, what's unusual was the situation that prevailed during the Cold War, where we engaged in strategic competition with the Soviet Union, but traded very little with them. Right. Historically, it's been more typical for countries to have both economic relations and strategic interactions, and it hasn't always prevented war. Before the First World War, Britain and Germany were one another's leading or close to leading trading and investment partners, but in the end, politics, geopolitics overwhelmed economics. Just the other thing I would say is that the economic relationship between the United States and China is not entirely equal. In certain respects, it appears that China has been getting the better side of that deal. The Chinese have also been exploiting the relationship to promote not only the growth of their economy, but the development of their military capabilities. The last thing I would say is that I think in the long run, the Chinese hope to diminish their dependence on economic interaction with the United States so as to increase their strategic independence. They can't entirely eliminate it, but I think they believe that they passed through a period when, in fact, they were so dependent on American capital and American markets that they were constrained strategically. They'd like to move away from that in the long run.
I just add a couple points. I think it would be a mistake to set the bilateral relationship with China above our interests. And we cannot make the preservation of that relationship our objective. So that's the first point, which I think, it has created complications for American policy on China for quite some time now. The second thing I would say is that we should avoid issue linkage in the relationship. I think that's very dangerous. So, for example, getting the Chinese to put pressure on North Korea, therefore we back off on, say, the South China Sea or pick another issue set like Taiwan. That would be a tremendous mistake because the region is watching that and they're looking for signs that the Americans are going to sacrifice their interests. So in the context of the broader relationship, I think your point is right. It's a big relationship that has a lot of kind of elements of competition and cooperation, but we have to be clear-eyed about what our actual interests are in the context of that.
I would just add one other point to that. Security competition is complicated in the context of economic interdependence. There's no getting away from that. But the fact is the balance of risks that North Korea poses to the United States and China are different. The risks to the United States as a result of North Korean behavior are far greater. Where the balance of interests are concerned, they're parallel. China has an interest in avoiding an explosion on the peninsula. The United States has a comparable interest. So because the balance of risks are greater for us, I think it really behooves China to do whatever they can to push the North Koreans, at least in the near term, to the negotiating table, and then give diplomacy a chance to figure out what can be put in place to at least buy some time until we can get our hands around more permanent sorts of solutions.
Senator, the only thing I would add to these very good comments is that you mentioned in your question the role that potentially greater economic interdependence could have in mollifying states' policies in the region. And I think while many of us teach those theories in the classroom, what's been very clear in Asia is that China's growing economic interaction in the region has not had a mollifying impact on their foreign policy. It has actually made them leverage that economic tools to their benefit in very draconian ways, whether it is economic sanctions against South Korea over THAAD or its tropical fruits from the Philippines or its rare earth minerals to Japan. There's a very clear pattern of how China uses economic leverage, uses economic interdependence in ways that are not one would not consider very productive for overall peace.